Thank you everyone for joining us here at First Pull Request live on Zoom. This is a world premiere, of a little workshop that Simon and I had put together that really just kind of grows out of some, our own activity as people who really love and want to promote open source software, and kind of like a little tradition in the data journalism world where I came up of, peers teaching peers. And, once we learn how to do something, we try to share it with as many other people as possible. And so really the goal of this is really just to share kind of what we see as a basic fundamental skill of open source software to help others learn it. I think we can get through the course materials in 60 to 90 minutes, maybe even faster, just kind of depending on how things go. But I am not in a hurry at all. And so we can go at whatever pace works for you, or just for the material. Because it is our first time teaching it, there will definitely be a few hinks and bugs. And so I appreciate your patience at the outset. I should probably introduce myself. My name is Ben Welsh. I am broadcasting to you live from Little Tokyo in downtown Los Angeles. I have been a data journalist at the Los Angeles Times for 15 years next week. This year, I'm currently on a fellowship at Stanford University, where I'm working in partnership with the journalism school there on a project called Big Local News, which tries to make data tools to work with data more accessible to the local newsrooms across the world. I am joined by my co-instructor, Simon Willison. Simon, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Simon Willison. I've been an open source developer for nearly 20 years, I think. I worked on what became Django, the web framework. More recently, I spent the past 5 years working on a project called Dataset, which is open source software aimed at helping people analyze and publish their data. I did a Stanford fellowship a few years ago, which completely ruined me because I got to work on whatever I thought was interesting, and I've continued to do that unpaid ever since. So I'm coming to you from Half Moon Bay, just south of San Francisco. And yeah, I've always been, I spent a lot of my career journalism adjacent. I like writing tools and writing software that journalists can use. So this workshop meshes two of my interests really well.
All right, well, thank you for joining us. So Simon will just be here chiming in and correcting all my mistakes and helping me kind of work us through this material. Obviously, not obviously, but let me just say, please interrupt us or ask questions or speak up as we go through this stuff. We want to make sure that you guys get it. There's 5 to 10 pieces of absolutely outrageous nerd jargon that we're going to have to try to struggle to define and explain. And I'm sure we won't be perfect at it, or we might use some other weird terms that you haven't encountered before. And if we do, just stop us or just ask. You can just honestly just interrupt over the microphone is fine, or just toss something in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. And that's it. So that's the deal. My hope is we can work through this, and the goal is to show you how to make changes to open source software, to look at the code that other folks have published on the web, make a tweak, and suggest that they include it. And that process is called a pull request when it's done via the website github.com, which is the most popular code management site. There's other words for it. That's what GitHub calls it. And our goal is to teach you how to do that today. And this technique is really a basic skill of software development that if you are interested in becoming a developer or just a hobbyist who contributes to code, you're going to want to learn. And for the purposes of the demonstration, everyone who works through the class will make a pull request today to an open source website that I maintain, which we'll look at in a minute. Before we get into that, I'd like everybody to go to the web address that I've put right here in our little help file, and it is at bit.ly/first-pr. And PR is a common piece of slang for a pull request, right? So there's our first gunky jargon. So it's bit.ly/first-pr. And if you go there, you'll see the script we wrote, which we're going to walk through together, which contains everything we're going to cover. Now, before I launch into that, I want to open it up to everybody who's come to see if there's any questions. So before we begin, does anybody have any questions about the class or just things in general? No? Okay. Arky, I see you shared the link. Is that working for you? I'll take that as a yes. All right, everybody. So here we go on the site. Let's begin. So in the first chapter, we kind of cover what we're going to do here. And that is, of course, make this code contribution, which is known as a pull request. The site that everyone will be contributing to is called the E.E. Cummings Free Poetry Archive. This is a website that's at the domain cummings.ee. And everything about this website is open source software that is hosted on GitHub and that anyone can contribute to. And the mission of this site is to transcribe the poetry of E.E. Cummings as it gradually enters the public domain. The way that copyright law works in the United States is that after a work is created, it is protected legally as the intellectual property of the author or the owner of it. But then after a certain number of years, it expires and it enters what's called the public domain, which it effectively becomes open source of its own. And anyone is able to resell, repackage, or remix it in any way they like. We're in an interesting moment now, which is each January 1st, when the next year of old material goes live, we're gradually crawling through the 1920s right now here in the United States, which means that many works of modernist poetry, early cinema, and early popular music are beginning to enter the public domain. Famously, last year, The Great Gatsby became a public domain item, and so you can look forward to Simon's graphic novel casting his pets in The Great Gatsby, or I don't know what exactly, right? But whatever you would want to do would be totally free at this point. And as someone who loves open source software, but also public domain and is a little bit of an amateur archivist, I just took on as a hobby during the pandemic the mission of trying to open up E.E. Cummings' work. And so for the last couple of years, I've been leading the drive to gradually enter all of the poems into the site as they open. And this year on January 1st, a book that came out in 1926 called Is 5, which is the fourth book by E.E. Cummings, entered the public domain. It has 88 poems in the book, and currently only 28 of them have been entered into the website, which is really just the process of transcription. I've gone to the Los Angeles Public Library, the Central Library downtown, where they have a first edition of the book, and I scanned that in and uploaded it to the Internet Archive. And so the process, isn't that beautiful? The process of transcription is really taking the copy that appears in these scans and key punching them into a computer file that can go into the website, okay? And that's all done on github.com via what's called a code repository, which I'm looking at right here. Simon, how would you define a code repository?
So a repository, that's a surprisingly tricky question. It's like a folder. It's a directory on a computer where you keep all of the code that exists in a single project. With a GitHub repository, that's a thing that you've then published either publicly so anyone can see it, or GitHub also lets you have private repositories that you can use to collaborate with other people. So there are people who will debate how much should go into a repository. They'll say, put everything that your company does in a single repository, have they call it a mono repository. This is not a debate for today. For our purposes, something like Cummings.ee is a perfect example of the size of project that you might want to have an individual project repository for.
Right. So all the code that makes the website that we're looking at right here, everything that puts this together is contained within this kind of magic folder hosted by github.com. And because I've made the code open source, aka open to the public's review, I'm actually able to host it for free, which is one of the nice things about GitHub and one of the chief reasons why it's become the dominant place to find open source software. In a sense, GitHub is effectively a social network for these code repositories or these folders. And so within this website, you can find the code that powers Django, the project that Simon worked on. You can find the code that what was on the initial space missions from NASA. You can find the code that runs inside of your smartwatch, and just literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of software projects each have a page like this one that's project specific, where they store all of the files that kind of make the application, but then they also collaborate with other developers to carefully make changes to that code using a system called version control, which is just really computer programming tricks for very carefully managing edits to individual files to make sure you don't break the code or that two people don't make conflicting changes. Any questions about GitHub or repositories? No? Okay, so
I've always been confused by GitHub. Is there any good tutorial or book to explain this? Because every time I've tried to learn it, I've just given up.
And you get stuck with trying to like create a repository with your terminal, or where do you get caught up?
I usually lose track of how to make the whole thing work.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that's especially tricky because you have on the web, you have this magic folder that exists also as a web page or thing. But then traditionally, when you're then working on those code files, you have to have a copy of those files on your computer as well, right? And
Correct.
so part of the dance of computer programming traditionally has been the to and fro of the changes that you make on your computer versus what you submit and send to the sort of origin, as they call it, the sort of mothership repository that's on the web. Now,
It's
one
also
thing,
worth-
go ahead, Simon.
So GitHub is the website. Git is the software you use to manage the changes. Git has notoriously, it's one of the hardest pieces of software to use in all of computer programming. Like I've been using it for probably 15 years. I use about 5% of the functionality, and I frequently find myself getting confused when I dive into some of the more complicated parts.
Oh, good. It's not just me.
No,
Oh, no, that's really important to understand. Git is a nightmare to use.
Yes.
Everyone acknowledges it. The thing is that because we all use it, it's difficult to adopt something else. What we're going to show you today is ways to use the GitHub web interface to avoid quite a lot of the horrors of having to use Git. So this workshop, you won't be having to open a terminal at all, but you'll still be able to create edits and propose changes.
That's exactly right. And like, I think, Ron, that the terminal stuff I've seen trip up literally hundreds of students teaching this stuff. If that's where you're having trouble, I think the stuff we'll cover today, which is pretty new technology, will keep you entirely in the browser. And I think you can do quite a lot of coding that way. It kind of depends what you're trying to do. But if you want something that's in between everything in the browser and the hell of the terminal, there's an application called GitHub Desktop, and it's really intended to be a bridge between the copy that's on your computer and the copy that's on the web. And I know that quite a lot of developers, even people who are very skilled at the terminal, prefer tools like that just because they think they're easier. And so my advice would be to seek out GitHub Desktop beyond this class, perhaps. Also, GitHub.com has a pretty excellent help section. And if you haven't looked at it in a while, I would just go look at their really introductory materials, like how do I even get started? And I bet you it would be more helpful than the last time you looked.
All right.
So now the thing I need everyone to do is to log into github.com. So if you already have an account, great, just log into it. If you don't, I need you to make one now, okay? And I am going to open up an incognito web browser and try to do that myself, okay? I think I have an account I made for this, but let's see if it shows up. Here's an older one. Maybe I can use that. Because I need to log in as just like as a regular old user like you guys, not as the administrator of the Cummings.ee repository. Because I'm the administrator of that, I have special powers that the average person on GitHub doesn't. If you think about it, a repository can be open source. It can be legible and readable and accessible to all people, but you can't let edits to the code be accessible to all people because then anybody could hack everything, right? And so the way that open source software is managed, you know, as well as it is managed, is that you have a group of sort of super users who are often called maintainers or owners, and they are the ones who manage what is allowed to be let into the sort of main or master collection of code in the repository. And then everyone else as an outsider is allowed to read the code, to run the code on their own independently, right? But then also make changes and suggest those changes go back into the process, right? And that is where the maintainers then come in to try to fix it. And we'll see how all that works, okay? So I'm going to make a new GitHub account right here that needs a number, okay? You guys can watch me flail. Okay. How about that? Okay, I'm going to generate a password. There we go. There we go. What should my username be, guys?
First PR. See if you can get that one.
Ah, how about that? I do not want emails.
No.
All right, then you have to solve a little puzzle. This is where we prove we're human. I think it's that one. And then it's this one, the piggies. Okay, now we've created our account. It's gonna email me something. Okay, let's see if I get that email.
A launch code. I haven't seen this flow in a very long time. They've done all sorts of things to it.
Yeah. There's my, okay, I just got the email. It is 916-10570. Okay, 50 plus. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, as a person who works with data all day, I love to pollute other people's data. It's not a nice thing about me. Okay, continue for free. Wow, GitHub.
Whoa.
That's what Microsoft pays for right there, dude. All right, so we're in. I now have a totally blank GitHub account, right? I'm a total newbie on the site. You can see in the upper right, there's ways to customize your account. If you haven't done it, I'd recommend turning on two-factor authentication, though I won't do that here today. And you can see there's really not a lot going on here, but one of the first buttons that's available to you is create a repository, right? Because that's what GitHub is for, is to create these code folders. And so if you wanted to, you could create a public or private repository. They hold your work. You don't need to do that here for today, but this is just an example of kind of why it's there. And now we'll see if I go to the address for Cummings.ee, what I see here is slightly different than in my other browser tab where I am an administrator, where here you can see there's a settings thing that allows me to muck with the repo. And here you can see there is not, right? Because now I'm an outsider contributor. I'm not the maintainer. And so what I can do is a little more restricted. All right. So has everybody been able or already have a GitHub account? Are we all into the site and ready to go? Great. I see some thumbs up. If anybody's having issues, it's totally fine. Just feel free to speak up. Okay. If you haven't done it yet, in chapter 2 of the class, there's a link down here at the bottom that goes to the code repository. I'd just like you to open that in a tab so that you're in the same place that I am right here. Okay, once you have that up, you have the repository. Okay. So once we have the code, we should maybe look at what's actually in here a little bit. You can see a sort of directory structure like you would find on your Windows or Apple computer, where it sort of has files and folders that are organized within like a little tree structure, pretty traditional stuff. This particular collection of files is everything necessary to build the website, and it's organized into what's called generically a framework. A framework is just like a tool belt of code that's been put together by other developers to make it easier to just get stuff done. So Django, which Simon mentioned, is what you might call a framework. It's a bunch of Python code that does a million different things that make it easier to build a dynamic website, as well as do other things. You may have heard of other frameworks called like Ruby on Rails or React or Gatsby. And these are all just different sort of competing systems in different programming languages to create tool belts that make it easier to get stuff done. And it just so happens, it's not that important, but it just so happens that this repository and this website uses a framework called Baker, which was invented at the Los Angeles Times to help us build all of our special projects. And so, you want to do live election results outside of the content management system, or a big, long, beautiful scrolling feature, right? You might need to write your own custom code. And so Baker was the tool that we wrote to do that. It's in use currently at the LA Times, as well as at ProPublica, the Baltimore Banner, and the City. If you're interested in learning more about Baker, we have a whole separate class about that, which I taught at the NICAR conference last year. It's called First Visual Story, and it will guide you through how to use Baker, or really any sort of static site framework, as it's called, to build your own custom page that you can publish outside of the content management system where you work, or just really your own microsite. And so because I was familiar with using that at the LA Times, I used it to make this little microsite, Cummings.ee. And it really could be used to make almost any website if you used it properly. So we don't need to learn everything about how it works, but one challenge of contributing to an open source project is, even if you just want to correct a typo or add a very narrow feature or fix a small bug, you do kind of have to go through the sort of like sussing out process of like, how is this thing even put together, and where are all the things, and sort of gradually learning kind of the system by which the developers have put their.
Hello and welcome to Git and GitHub for Poets. This is
and you can, and so here we won't cover everything that has to do with it, but I can just tell you that in the underscore data folder, there's another folder called Poems. I just ask everybody to click in here and then into is5, right? And so I just happen to know this is the place to go because I created this repository. And so in the data directory, there's a folder for each of the 4 books that we've entered. And then in each of those, there's a file for each of the poems, right? And so we can see that, for instance, in the first file that we're looking at, which is for the first poem in the 5 American series, we can see a file that contains the poem and some extra metadata. If I go to Cummings.ee and I click into the location of that same poem here, we can see that the exact same stuff that's on the page is in that data file. And the way that the website works, which we won't cover in any depth, is it takes the data from these files and it templates them into the website. And that's how this kind of site works. It's using that particular framework. All of those things are just opinionated decisions I made as the initial developer and are up for debate. But, part of figuring out or contributing to somebody else's code is kind of like sniffing around how it's set up and figuring out what you might want to do or don't do. Like Simon, when you first encounter someone else's code, how do you figure out what it's doing?
Well, it depends on which programming language they're using. If it's a JavaScript thing, there's a file called package.json that you can go and look at. If it's Python, you can look at requirements.txt. But generally, I'll hope that they've got a README that explains what's going on. So the good projects do, a lot of projects don't bother. And then often what I'll do is I'll actually use the GitHub search interface. So I'll say, okay, I know that there's a poem that uses the word sinuous in there. I will search for sinuous, and that will show me which file. Here we go. And so now I've gone from looking at the front page to actually having an idea of how this thing is structured. So often I will use GitHub code search quite extensively just to try and figure out, okay, this thing I want to, this page on the website, where is that in the repository? And that'll get me there really quickly.
And then also, if you're looking to contribute, a really natural place to look is what's called the issue tracker, or the issues tab. So if you see here in the upper left where my mouse is, there's just a little link that says issue with, I guess, a bullseye. I'm not even sure I know what that is. And in it, and this is like, like you might have in your workplace, if you work anywhere close to software, this is sort of an open source version of a classic ticket manager, like you might have in Jira or any other of those tools like that. And it's really a place where the maintainers of a project, but also the users can raise bugs, can propose features, can hold discussions about what to do with the website. And it is a venue for kind of managing little changes that get made to the code over time, right?
I'm going to throw a quick plug for GitHub Issues. If you've used Jira, you probably hate Jira. I don't think I've ever met somebody who didn't absolutely despise it. It does the job. GitHub Issues is the only issue tracker I've ever used that I don't hate. And this is high praise indeed. I run my life out of it. I've got like private GitHub repositories for household chores and things that use GitHub Issues because it works so well for me.
Yeah, it's a pretty nice tool. And just to show it like on another project, an open source project you've probably heard something about in the last few months is Mastodon, which is an attempt to create an open source competitor to Twitter. And you can see here, this is, of course, a very active project. It's been around a number of years. And you see here, if you look in their issues tracker, you'll see that there's more than 3,000 issues where people all around the world who are surging into the site have been suggesting things. I think I have one in here. If we search for me, let's see if we can find it. No? How do you filter for person?
Try user : Palewire. Oh, no, that didn't work at all. That's everything.
Your issues. How about that?
There we go. Has that worked? No.
I definitely filed a bug, whatever. Oh, I'm not logged in as me. I'm logged in as this other weird guy.
There you go. That makes sense.
So just to like make the point, I was using Mastodon as I'm exploring it like everyone else in the world. And I found what I thought to be a bug, which was that in the color choice that they had made for kind of the Toot button wasn't passing a certain kind of accessibility test. Not that it was such a crime or whatever. And so what I did is I went into their issue tracker and I tried to document this bug, right? And so it was just like, hey, I ran this one particular test for accessibility. I found that the colors aren't, totally up to snuff. I did an experiment where maybe we could change it to something else that's within the color scheme. And so, hey, what do you think of that idea, right? And so this is basically me filing a bug report with the owners of this repository and just kind of seeing what they think, trying to document what I was thinking so that, they don't have to read my mind. And, somebody might get around to it at some point. I think this particular group of developers is pretty flooded with activity. And so I don't really blame them for not having got to it yet. But that's an example of kind of a real life bug report that I made myself, right? And then the pull request or the change would be intended to address that, right? And so issues are often the targets of pull requests or code changes where you're saying, well, we have this particular issue that we want to address. I've got the code that's intended to address it. And those two things kind of go together. And so if we look back at the Cummings.ee issue tracker, I've created a couple dozen tickets right here for individual poems that are missing from the website, right? So if we look at the page for is5 on Cummings.ee, we can see that only 28 of the book's 88 poems have been entered. There's 60 to go. And the ones that haven't been entered are grayed out in the table of contents, right? And what I've done is I went through and picked about 20 that aren't very long and made tickets for each of them. And then in each ticket, I included a link to the file in the file system where the poem should go, and a link to the scan from the LA Public Library where the poem appears on the page, right? And so what I'm now going to ask is that we just kind of go through everybody who's here as a participant and we kind of assign different people tickets, right? And there actually is a system for doing this within the issue tracker, which I'll show with I'll use Simon as my example. Simon, you're going to enter one, right?
Definitely. Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to go down to the one at the bottom and just start there. And I'm going to say, supposing I dreamed this is going to be Simon's assignment. And within the interface of the ticket, there's ways for tagging things and grouping them. And then there's also a way of assigning people to manage the ticket. Is that your username, Simon?
Oh, I don't think it's going to let you because I'm not a current participant in this repository. That's annoying. So, yeah,
okay. So you,
I don't
you won't just show up? So I
no,
could tag you.
It looks like you have to add people as maintainers. So maybe the assigning function isn't quite going to work. We can assign with comments instead.
Yeah, so I'm going to say, Simon, you want to take this one. And then here you can see there's kind of a comment thread that unfurls in the issues where you can have a discussion about what's going on. So Simon's going to take that one. Let me just call up our chat, and we have 10 folks in the chat, and I'm just going to go through everybody and assign each of you one to manage. I won't tag you or do whatever, but I just want to make sure we don't have two people doing the same poem is all, right? And this is where the software can really be helpful for divvying things up so that, you know, people don't end up repeating each other's work. And so just looking at our class list, Ron, you're the next one on the list. Ron, I'm going to give you nobody wears a yellow. That's ticket number 182. Okay.
All right.
Next on the list is Adrian. Adrian, I'm going to give you, it is so long since my heart has been with yours. That's ticket number 183. All right. Arky, I'm going to give you number 184, which is if within tonight's erect. If within tonight's erect goes to Arky at number 184. Jose, you're going to get number 185, which is I go to this window. Arky is number 185. That's Jose. Jose is number 185. Arky's number 184. Michael, you're going to be number 186, which is touching you. I say it being spring. Spring being one of the classic words in E.E. Cummings poetry, recurs through the years in many, many poems. Touching you, I say it being spring, goes to Michael. Sean, you got number 187. That's our touching hearts slenderly comprehend. Our touching hearts slenderly comprehend, number 187, goes to Sean. And then Tom, I've got you at number 189 with Poets, Yegs, and Thirsties. Poets, Yegs, and Thirsties, number 189 goes to Tom. Okay, so you can go in and you can leave a comment if you just want to mark it. But what I really ask you to do, for instance, Tom, is to go in here and open these two links into two different tabs so that you have both the empty file and the poem you're going to transcribe. I'm going to give myself a poem. Yes. I'm going to go with weazened, irrefutable, unastonished. All right, which I hope is not how you feel after this class. That's going to be assigned to me. And just to kind of make the point, tickets can be assigned once you're associated with a repository. There's kind of a process here for just like tagging people and sticking them in. And now this ticket belongs to me, right? And there's a whole set of buttons and things to do all kinds of stuff with issues and to manage them. All right. So everybody's got their issue? Okay, cool. So now we're almost ready to begin work. There's just one more piece of jargony software we got to cover, which is YAML. Okay, so YAML, Y-A-M-L, you can see it in the file extension of your poetry file. Simon, what's YAML?
YAML ain't a markup language, or there have been various acronyms over the time. The most recent one is that.
Right. So YAML is it's a file format. It's an acronym, and it's really just a data storage language that is used across a lot of different programming domains and in different places just to hold data. And it's sort of like a single row in a spreadsheet is one way to think about a YAML file. It can do more than that, but that's one way to think about it. And each one of these YAML files contains all the metadata necessary for an individual poem. Just to refer back to the one we were looking at initially, you can see that the title of the poem is there. The first line of the poem is there, which is in an index elsewhere on the site. And then most importantly, the content of the poem is in an attribute called text. So the value that's before the colon is like the name of the column or the name of the key of the value. And then following the colon is the value itself. And you can see in our documentation that YAML supports, strings, numbers, and then lists, and also nested objects as well. And so you can kind of use YAML to structure kind of whatever you want, right? But in the case of the Cummings EE repository, it's intended to structure a poem, right? So I sort of invented a very simple set of metadata for storing those poems. And so our mission is going to be to edit the YAML file that you've been assigned, right? And mine was this one, to add that text attribute and then to type in the poem. All right, so let's do it. Sean, you raised your hand. What's up, man?
I was just curious if you could mention what part of your code is parsing the YAML text strings and actually putting them, like turning them into HTML on the website. Just for reference later, I'd be curious to look at
of course. So the underscore data folder in a Baker project, this is something particular to Baker, right? So in the Baker framework, any file that's put into the underscore data folder is parsed by the framework and converted into like an object that then can be put onto the page you're making, right? And the Baker system uses the Node.js programming language. And so the code that does this is not even in our project. It's like deep down in the bowels of Baker, which is itself an open source code repository on the LA Times account, right? Deep down within the code of this like toolkit is something that knows to look in the underscore data folder and parse all of the files, right? And it's smart enough to parse comma separated files, JSON files, a couple other formats, and YAML. And so basically, Baker's set up to try to make your life easier, right? But it sort of assumes certain things to do that. And so it assumes that if you put a file into the data folder, you want it to be parsed and you want it to be available to be on the page. And then the name of the file is then accessible when you make the template. And so like I'd have to go back in my memory here, but there's a layouts folder that has all of the HTML templates. And you can see that there's, for instance, the book detail page, which is what corresponds to this page on the website about is5 and this page about tulips and chimneys. All four of these pages are made with the same template. And we see here in this template, it's quite complicated for dumb reasons because I'm not very good at coding. You can see that it's using templating tags to kind of print out the title of the book, its description, and then that table of contents, right? And so that data is coming from the underscore data folder. If we look at the poem detail page, which takes the YAML file and makes the poem, you can see that here it's using a sort of little bit of template code to loop through each line of the poem and print it line by line. It's not just puking the text onto the page because there's some complicated styles that have to be done to maintain the integrity of E.E. Cummings' unusual typography. But basically, the stuff you're doing is coming out kind of right here, right? And so the poem text, which is that attribute that we see in the YAML file, is being parsed by a custom function that I've written. And then each line in it is being printed into the template. Does that answer your question, Sean?
Yeah, thanks.
Yep. And there's a whole world here where these line numbers are used to manage the custom indentations of E.E. Cummings, which is quite a lot of fun. If you really are into CSS, there's some fun ways to contribute. This is part of why I did this project. Like, for instance, this poem is sideways, which is actually how it was intended by E.E. Cummings. And so we had to customize the CSS just for this page. My favorite ticket in our issue tracker currently is about that poem, which is called Life Hurl, because it's actually a question of academic dispute about whether the poem should be rotated clockwise, as it was done in the first edition, or counterclockwise, as it was done in George Firmage's complete poems. I currently have this ticket being reviewed by George Webster, who is America's leading E.E. Cummings scholar. He believes that counterclockwise is correct, and that because that is how E.E. Cummings initially intended it in his personal notes from the archives. Scholars have been reviewed. He's going to scan that for me when he can find. He actually has E.E. Cummings papers, and so he will try to scan that for me, and we will resolve the ticket. So this is a fun ticket that's not about code; it's about something silly. But anyway, what do you guys? This is, and then you get philosophical, which is like, well, should our website recreate what the first edition was faithfully, or should it recreate what E.E. Cummings' intention was that was later restored by scholars, 60, 70 years later, right?
I think the answer there is it has to expose all of it. Like if there's a poem with many different variants, the web page can just keep on scrolling.
So you would say we should print it rotated both ways? I
think the original way first, and then the other way with copious explanations and meticulous nitpicking about why these things are.
I think the Library of America tries to go with what the author intended.
Yeah, and that's what the scholars tend to like. So I have right here with me, there's a guy named George Firmage, and so George Firmage is the guy who put together what's called complete poems. which is done by LiveWrite, who still exists as a publisher, who published the first edition. And his sort of philosophy in putting the book together was to restore Cummings' intent.
Right, but you can do better than that. You can both have it at Cummings' intent and have all of the nitpicky academic debates afterwards.
I think that's right. I think we have to have a philosophy for the site, which I have to deal with when I merge things. But I think I kind of am leaning towards we go with the intent once it's resolved, and then maybe we have a footnote that could link to this ticket, or I don't know what. But it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question, and so that's my life as a maintainer. Thank you for indulging me. And so where we left was we had Sean's question about the template, and we got that handled. And so I think we're maybe ready to start actually editing the code. So everybody click that first link in your ticket and get up your kind of file, which you're going to edit, which should only have the title and the first line. If it has the text already, I've made a mistake and we need to find you another one. Just speak up. But to kind of get back to what Ron was saying earlier, I need to get this in my other browser. Hold on. The traditional way of doing Git until the last few years was to make a copy of the repository on your computer and to use your terminal to sort of interact with the file, right? But now GitHub has some really powerful tools for making these edits directly in your browser. And since what we're doing is pretty simple, we're going to do that and get you guys kind of like on the board without having to deal with all the terminal crap. And that really awesome tool is kind of buried within GitHub's interface. Like you might not even know it's there, right? And what it is it's this pencil tool right here in the right-hand side, the upper right of the file viewer. You can hit that down arrow. I want everybody to hit that down arrow and just look at it. And GitHub actually offers two different ways to edit your stuff in your browser. If you pick the first option, edit this file, you'll get their kind of like legacy option that they developed a few years ago, which is very nice, right? And is one way to edit the file in the browser. But below that, you can see that there's a link that says open in github.dev. And this is like the cool new thing that they are going to gradually replace the older stuff with that has a lot more cool features and things to take advantage of. And so I'm going to ask everybody to hit open in github.dev in that pull down. Simon, you want to explain what this is?
Yeah, this is so Microsoft have a text editor you can install on your computer called VS Code, Visual Studio Code, and it's one of the best pieces of software they've released in years. It's completely open source, and this is it. It turns out it's written in JavaScript, and it can run in a browser just as well as it runs on your computer. So when you hit github.dev, they're actually launching effectively the leading edge Microsoft like code editing environment purely in your browser for you to edit files directly on GitHub. This is a revelation for me. Like, I never thought I would spend more of my time in a browser writing code than I would doing it on like a proper computer. But actually, no, it's such a good editor. And it's so convenient. You know, it's a click in the menu to get there that I actually find myself using this for all kinds of different projects now. So yeah, this is effectively, I think this is best of breed code editing experience, and it's freely available, and you just click a button in your browser and off you go.
Yeah, and you could do this on a Chromebook or even on your phone, and it makes these tools a lot more accessible to people too. You don't need a $2,000 MacBook, you know, which I think is very important personally. So what I've done is I've opened up my poem. You should see yours, and then in chapter 6 about editing the code, I have a little snippet just to get you started. And this is just intended to be the like shell of where your text attribute is going to go. You'll notice that there's this sort of little configuration bit here on this attribute. That's because unlike the other values in our YAML file, this is a multi-line entry, right? So the poem is going to go over more than one line of code. And this is just one way of telling YAML that that's what's going to happen, right? And then the -1 tells it each line will have one white space at the start of it that isn't part of the poem, that's just there to let you know that this is one kind of chunk, right? And so you should just paste something that's like in here, and then below it, we just want to start typing the poem, right? And so I'm going to get to the poem myself. Well, let me grab the link from my ticket. So back in my ticket, I have this other link, right? And I can go to that page. And what I'm going to do is just do a split screen, which, you know, this is obviously a matter of taste or whatever. Different people like to do things different ways, but I'm going to split my screen, and I can see here on the right-hand side of this page is the poem that I need to type. And so I'm just going to type it in. And so this is maybe going to take us all, depending on how long your poem is, you know, 5 to 10 minutes. And so I just ask everybody to kind of do their best to transcribe what they see on the page. Okay, so I'm just going to shut up for a minute and do that. And you go ahead and do yours too. If you have any, Adrian, what's up?
Just want to confirm we are retyping the first line, like, because there's the
Yes.
first line attribute, and then but in the text you want the first line to start with the first line.
That's correct. Yeah, and the first line attribute is there so that I could make make this page on the website, which is a common type of index for poetry if you've ever seen it, you know.
Yeah, I got you. Just wanted to make sure.
Yep.
Okay, how do I get back to the book?
Oh, so in your ticket, Ron, there's a link. The second link in your ticket. Which poem is yours?
Yellow.
So for instance, Nobody Wears a Yellow. We can see the link is right here, which I'm going to try to drop in the chat and see how I do. Okay. So Ron, there's your link. All right.
Okay, I'll just go back to the issue. Should be
Okay,
there.
awesome. All right.
Okay.
Can you tell that when E. Cummings wrote these, typewriters were the cool new thing? I don't think we would have these poems if they'd never invented the typewriter. There's spring, the magic word. And you know, obviously the punctuation is inaccurate to, according to your copy desk or your 6th grade English teacher, but that is intentional on the poet's part. So we should just try to mirror as closely as we can what he's up to. Okay, now I'm just going to proof it. Still makes me laugh sometimes. These were, of course, many of these were intended as a gag. E. Cummings was a goofball, especially when he was young. If you don't like the poetry, you might be interested in his memoir he wrote after coming back home from World War I, which recently entered the public domain and has been republished by the New York Review of Books. It's called The Enormous Room, and it's about being a prisoner of war in France. But he mostly plays it for laughs. And it's sort of a young man sort of mockingly describing his encounter with the bureaucracy of war. I have proofed mine twice, and I'm somewhat confident in my work. Ultimately, all submissions will be proofed against the Firmage by yours truly. See. All right, I'm going to give everybody 2 or 3 more minutes. If you need more time than that, it's totally fine. Just speak up. But I'm going to say in 2 or 3 minutes we'll move on.
I had a couple of quick questions.
Yes.
One, I was wondering if we all should be using that like pipe -1 notation, or that's particular to just your poem that you were doing.
everyone should put that in there. Because the pipe tells the YAML that this will be a multi-line string, right? That it's going to go
Oh, I
across
see.
more than one line of text, so it knows how to parse it. And then the -1 is a configuration option that tells it there will be one white space at the start of each row, right? If you don't get this perfectly right, that's something we would litigate in the pull request, which we'll see in a minute, right? But that's the intent of how I've configured the YAML file. I admit it's a little annoying.
And in that case, we should also have a white space at the beginning of each.
Yes, each line
Wow.
should have a single white space. And what you'll find in VS Code is that once you start doing that, every time you hit enter, it will do it for you automatically. It's sort of smart enough to figure that out.
My other question was, I don't know, maybe now that I added this, it's not doing anymore, but originally there was a colon in the poem, and the
Yes.
colon seemed to be telling the code editor that I was giving some other like YAML
Yes.
configuration.
Yeah. So colons are kind of reserved for use in parsing the YAML, right? We see that after each of our guys. I think that if you see, I have a colon in my poem here. I think that if it follows the pipe in the -1, it'll chill out and be okay with that.
Once I added the white space in front of the line, then the text editor stopped highlighting it. So
Exactly.
I think that it's probably
That's exactly what happened, I bet, right? Because you know, even though this is sort of like arcane and like who knows what this is, it's sort of giving instructions, right? For like, this is how you're supposed to parse me.
Hey, Ben.
Mm-hmm.
Quick typographical question that I'm
Love
running
it.
into. Now that I realize I do most of my writing in Google Docs, and it autocorrects the M dash when I do the 2 regular dashes, and
Yes.
there are a couple in my poem, and I actually don't know how to do the M. I don't know if this is, I can Google it, I guess, really quick, but I'm
Yeah.
like,
No,
kind of like,
M dashes are tricky. Famously, you know, journalists love them. You know,
Right.
one of my favorite things working at the LA Times is like getting to like deal with all the old newspaper technology. And I once found the Coyote computer system, the first computers that were run at the LA Times, and they had a special key just for M dashes. So that's how much journalists love the M dash.
that's incredible.
So there's different ways to do it on different operating systems. You know, the easy, lazy way is just to Google it and then copy and paste it.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do.
But
right
since you've
now.
asked, you've allowed me to bring up one of my favorite hobby horses. You guys may
Oh.
tell that I like stupid, weird typography things. So I think one of the great failures of Simon and the Silicon Valley crowd is that they have abandoned the compose key. So the compose key was once a commonly found key where the right alt key is on your computer or in other common locations on a keyboard. And it was effectively, you would type that, and then you'd hit that key, and then you would enter a pattern, and it would give you more arcane characters more quickly. And it uses a pneumatic device where you would hit compose key, then say a tick and an A, and you would get the tick over the A. And if you did a tick and an E, you get the tick over the E. And if you did compose and 3 hyphens, you got an M dash, right? And so one thing that I've done, this is another pandemic splurge, is I bought myself a custom keyboard and I put a goddamn compose key on it. And Linux actually supports a compose key. So if you're smart, if you're wise enough to use Linux, the GNOME operating system will support a compose key.
Can you hold your keyboard up to the webcam, or is everything too tight to the
It's going to be filthy, but yeah, it's in the right alt position. I've got the custom keycap, dude. Because the other thing about the compose key is that it has a beautiful Unicode symbol that is actually like super heavy metal, guys. Like, this is the symbol of the compose key. Like, how heavy metal is that? The circle and square, that could be a tattoo, right? And in fact, it's a t-shirt on my Etsy shop, right? So if you really want to get into bullshit that I like, on my Etsy page, there's a compose key t-shirt. So long live the compose key. Silicon Valley, you've let us down yet again. Where is my anyway, I can't find it now. It's there. I should have worn that today.
Yeah, that would have been pretty cool. I'm on Ubuntu, so maybe I'll have it hack it into having it be my right alt key. I can probably.
That's the way to do it. I think it's in the GNOME settings or in your keyboard settings, maybe. Compose key right there. See it?
Yeah. There you go. Okay. Cool.
Oh, I
Learn
love
something new every day.
Love it. Thank you for letting me tell that story. The dumbest thing I bought during the pandemic is that tool to remove keycaps. Like it's this special tool that's just for pulling out keycaps. I should not admit this, but I did buy that. All right. So has everybody gotten their poem in? I know some of them are longer than others. What's that?
I know you love E.E. Cummings, but he's driving my copy editor heart crazy.
He would have loved that, Ron. Especially when he was young. He got kind of grumpy when he got old, if you ever read about him. He was a kind of classic modernist, really. You know, these are young, bright people who were kind of damaged by the war. And that's what a lot of their art is about. You know, Ezra Pound or Gertrude Stein or Ernest Hemingway would be other examples. And Cummings is one who, unlike a lot of the more liberal Greenwich Village types, became anti-communist, where many of them became pro-communist. And so the 1930s, for a lot of these literary characters at the time, were really a conflict between warring camps and their position toward the Soviet Union. Cummings made a trip to the Soviet Union, which he also wrote about, and became a pretty virulent anti-Soviet. Anyway. All right, so we got it in. Love it. All right, so now that we have it in, we have this in the text editor, but like, how do we get this back into the actual repository, right? And so this is where, if you were on your terminal, you would have to save the file and type these insane Git commands that like tell it how to do that. But because GitHub.dev is so great, we can now do that stuff just by clicking a couple buttons, right? And you can see here on the left-hand side of my text editor, we have a little icon that kind of looks like a tree, right? Or like a branch coming off with dots and lines, and it's got a blue circle on it, right? And that's like a little notification thing. And this is the commit dialog or the source control dialog, which allows you to log your changes that you're making to the code. And so this is another like techie concept of code repositories, is that every time you make a change into the version control system, you have to make a log entry. You have to say, I'm going to change these lines of code, right? And that's going to be stored as like a little transaction. And then also you typically will, if you're doing a good job, you'll provide a description of what you've done. And then that description is stored along with the change. And that little bundle of information or that transaction is called a commit or a code commit, right? And so what you typically do is you, after you make a change, you then write a message and then log it with the code commit. And the way you can do that in VS Code or GitHub Dev is by clicking that little tree button, right? So you get that thing. You can see here, it even provides a list of the changes you've made. And if I clicked on it, I get what's called the diff, right? So it's showing here on the left, here's what the file looked like before you made the change. Here's the diff or the change that you made on the right. So you can look at that. It's often a good idea to do this before you commit because you might accidentally change more than one file. I do that like every day, right? Or you might have changed something, made a typo that you didn't intend, and this can really highlight that change, right? So I see here, no, I think I pretty much got what I want. I'm feeling good about my diff. And so then the final thing to do is to then go to this text box in the upper left and to write that line to describe what you were doing, right? And so I'm gonna, and like this is always this sort of creative challenge, like what did I do? You know what I mean? And it's a good thought exercise to see if you can really summarize it. In this case, it's really just gonna, I'm gonna say I entered the name of this poem, so I'm just gonna copy and paste that. So I entered this guy, and that would be enough, I think, to have a good code commit message. But there's an extra piece of sugar that you could do on GitHub, which is you can link your code commit to the issue that you're talking about so that those two things are joined together on the website. And the way you do that, and I'd encourage you all to do this, is you then go back to the issue, and I almost always have to go back and look because I can't remember. But if I go back and look, I can see Weazened, Irrefutable, Unastonished was ticket number 190. Do you see that up there? So that's the number of my ticket. And so then over here in the editor, I'm going to say fixes #190. And you see how it's even auto-completing for me, right? Because it's connected to GitHub. Pretty cool, right? And so then I'm going to say fixes number 190. Fixes is kind of a magic word, which tells GitHub that if this code commit is accepted into the repository, you can close the ticket automatically. The human doesn't even have to go to close it. It'll do it for you. It's kind of nice, right? You don't have to. You could just put the number and that would still make the link, right? But I think this will fix the ticket, so I'm just going to put fixes. And then, so I would everybody do that, put in your description and try to tag your issue, and then hit this blue button, commit and push. Okay, then you're going to get this pop-up and we're going to wait for a second and then I'll explain what this pop-up is. But I'm going to give everybody a chance just to write their message and hit the button.
Sorry, Ben, can you just explain how, so I've got my tech, the YAML file there. So
Yes.
how do I find how to commit?
It's a little tricky at first because it's part of the odd interface of the text editor. But do you see on the left-hand side, there's a black bar that's up against the edge of the window?
Yeah.
The fourth icon down, does it have like a little blue pop-up?
Yeah.
So that, click that
yeah.
icon, and that's the source control tab. And so that's a tab within VS Code that actually, this is what makes VS Code so popular, is that the text editor is actually integrated with the version control system for you. And so you can use it to make changes to code without having to go into your terminal or to talk to Git and GitHub. It will do it on your behalf, right? And so by clicking that, you then get a new box should open up from the left. And then in that upper left text box, that's where you type your commit message. And then hit the blue button.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep, and you'll get to this pop-up and then we'll deal with that in a second. Everybody okay? Anybody stuck? Okay.
I didn't get to a pop-up. I'm just getting kind of a loading animation. I don't know, maybe need to.
When you hit commit and push,
Yeah.
you might try clicking it again. That's probably a web connection bug, would be my guess, because all this is happening over the internet.
I'm getting a similar thing, but what happened is a little window popped up that I'm supposed to type a name of a branch into.
That's what's going to come next after this. So did you already hit the fork repository button?
No, I just clicked commit and push and it went right to that.
Well, for some reason you didn't get this pop-up, but you're on the next step. And so if you're on the next step, you're okay, right? So basically, just to return to kind of one of our initial principles, we can't commit our code directly to my repository, or you can't because you don't have authority, right? I can't let anybody change my code. And so how do you get around that? Well, the way GitHub does it is it has you create a copy of my repository that you own and that you're allowed to do whatever you want with, right? And that's called a fork, right? So a fork is your personal copy of somebody else's code. And because it's open source, you can do whatever you want within certain limits, but you can't change the website, right? Because it's my version of the code that's connected to the website through a whole other set of technology. And so the forks are the sort of standard GitHub way of managing, making changes to code and then proposing they be accepted back in the original repository. It's just like a little cycle, right? You edit the code, you save it in your fork, and then the pull request is asking the owner of the original to accept the change that lives in your fork, right? But because this is your first commit, you don't have a fork yet, right? And so an initial step that GitHub is going to take here is it's going to say, well, you're trying to make changes. I'm reading right from the box now, right? You're trying to make changes to a project you don't have write access to, AKA you can't write to the repository, right? Do you want to create a fork of this project to commit your proposed changes? And my answer is yes. So I'm going to hit the blue button. Everybody else should hit the blue button too. And then that's going to go about creating a fork. And this is where it starts to get a little arcane, but you can see at the very top here, there's a pop-up box, right? And it's basically asking you to create a branch on your fork. So within repositories, there could be different copies of the code that sort of break off from each other. So let's say you own the repository and you want to work on a feature, but you don't want to have that go live as you're working on it. You want to be able to make commits and then after a certain amount of time, send that back into the main line of code. You do that by what's called a branch, right? And a branch is really like a mini fork. It's like a fork that's within the repository, right? Rather than like a whole separate repository. And this is a little confusing, but basically, you know, when you have write access to a repository, you traditionally create branches that you'll then send back for a merge. And so GitHub's default behavior is when you make a commit is to say, well, you want to branch that off, where you want to branch it. And they just see that as sort of a hygienic and kind of professional default setting so that people aren't just like ramming code into their master branch without thinking about it too much, right? It's a little annoying. It might not be necessary in this case. And but this is how it's set up. And so here,
one thing, the reason it's so useful here is that a pull request is actually about the changes in my branch here are the ones that I'm proposing. So it is good practice if you're working on lots of different things that will be pull requests, you want each of those things to be in a different branch. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird esoteric thing, but for this particular exercise that we're doing here, it's a really useful default.
Yeah. And so some people will get serious about their branch names and they might put the ticket number in the branch name or a descriptive thing. But in our case, we're just going to accept the default, which is patch 1 because it's your first patch. Another piece of jargon, a patch is really just like code that you want to change, right? Here's the change. That's the patch, right? And so I'm just going to click into that box. And as the instructions say, I'm going to hit enter, right? And then it's going to say, hey, you've committed changes to your fork. Do you want to switch to your fork and continue making changes? Say, yes, I want to switch to my fork. And
I can't even imagine what would happen if you said no to that. I think things would get very confusing.
Yeah. And so now we've moved over to the editor has now moved. And you can see that the URL, if you look at it carefully, is no longer palewire, me/Cummings.ee. It's firstpr/Cummings.ee because that's the name of my user. And so you're probably going to see your username in this spot in the URL as well. Did that work for everyone? Cool. So now back on GitHub, you have your own copy of the repository that's been created. And to make our pull request, we need to go there and interact with it. And so this is a little clunky as well, but if you hit the menu box in the menu line, the 3 lines at the LA Times, we call this the hamburger. If you hit the hamburger icon in the upper left, you can see that there's a link at the bottom called Go to Repository. Does everybody see that?
Oh.
Go ahead and hit that guy. And then in another tab, we're going to be right back at a repo. But we'll see in the upper left-hand corner, it's got the little fork icon and it's first PR now, right? And it says below forked from palewire. And so this is a copy of the repository that you now own and have write access to that contains the branch patch 1 that has your poem, right? And so in your repo, the poem has been entered. But since it's not in the original repository, it's not on the site yet. And so this is kind of the final step of your your journey is to then say, I'm going to propose to the maintainer of the original repository to accept my patch as a pull request. How about all that jargon, right? And you can see that GitHub knows this is what people do. And so they've even put a little pop-up yellow box at the top where they're saying, hey, somebody pushed to this patch just 1 minute ago. Would you want to compare and make a pull request out of that with this big green button? And it's like, that is in fact exactly what I want to do, right? And there's other buttons and other ways to do this in the interface, but they just know this is really common. So they've put this pop-up there, right? And so everybody should go ahead and click that green button, which is compare and pull request. And then you get to one final form. And so this is the pull request form. This is where you, the outside contributor, are going to propose your changes to the maintainer. You can see there's a little pull down here that says the base repository, palewire/EE Cummings, and its master branch is being kind of asked to accept a patch from the head repository. That's you, another terrible piece of jargon. And that repository is first PR, and it's coming from its patch 1 branch, right? And if I scroll down the page, you'll see there's the diff, right? It's going to say this is the change that's being proposed to be included. And in between, there's like a little text box and another space to write. And this box is really the place where you kind of make your case, right? So this is going to go in as a sort of ticket for the maintainer with your code as a proposal for inclusion. And what you put here is really can vary. But if you're making your first ever contribution, or if you're doing something complicated, or whatever, you have to realize you have to convince the person who runs the repository to accept your change, right? And so this forum is often a place where people try to be persuasive. They'll say, hey, there's this bug. You can see the bug in ticket number whatever. And I researched it and I found out that this was the problem. And then I figured out, here's how we're going to fix it. I made the change to fix it, and here it is. What do you think, right? And so like that type of rhetoric is really common. And then you'll see it in a second. The maintainer's job is to sort of review your proposal and try to responsibly decide whether to integrate your code, whether to ask for you to make some changes to it, or whether to reject your proposal, right? And this sort of interaction that happens is often done between total strangers on other sides of the planet. One of my favorite things in life is to wake up in the morning and like someone in Ukraine or Japan has sent me a pull request. It's just incredible, and it honestly blows my mind every time it happens. But that there's tens of thousands of these little interactions happening all around the world every day via GitHub. And so this will be your kind of first shot at that. Because this is something we're doing in a controlled environment together and the change we're making is pretty clear, I think that just us saying explicitly what we're doing, which is entering a poem and tagging the ticket, that those two things are probably kind of good enough to have a good pull request here. But I think usually, Simon is more of a maintainer than I am. Usually you're looking for maybe a little more than that, Simon, or what do you look for in with this message?
The big thing is, the worst thing that can happen is somebody shows up with a 100-line pull request for something that you didn't know they were even going to do, and now you have to read through the code. You don't understand any of the background. So the link to the issue is crucial for me, because I always want things to be discussed in an issue before they get to the point where people are submitting code. And then honestly, I used to write really long descriptions in these until I realized that a better thing to do with that is to have documentation that's in the repository, which you update as part of the pull request. So for my projects, I tend to encourage people to have a pull request which has tests and documentation and the implementation, and then you can have a sentence, and I don't care. But for projects that don't have documentation, or you end up wanting a bit more detail than that. Something which we can demonstrate actually with one of the pull requests I just filed is that you can file a pull request and then add your own comments to it. So you can actually get away with a sort of very short initial thing, but then start a conversation in a thread and link that into the code itself if you want to detail more about how you approach something.
Great tips. So once you kind of got your initial message together, you just hit this green button here, which says create pull request. And so I would ask everybody to do that. And you can see that now we're at the page that looks a lot like an issue, but unlike an issue, it has a file change attached to it, right? That's the major difference. That's what makes it the pull request. And you can actually see here at the top of the repository in the pull request tab, if you click there, are all the pull requests that have come in. And just in the last few minutes, everybody's pull requests are landing, right? We can see there actually were 2 ongoing discussions with 2 of our heroic contributors here at the bottom that I haven't resolved yet. And then here's all the transcriptions that we've been doing here in class, right?
If you go to one of my 2 ones, they've got a little bit of extra commentary in them, which might be interesting to see.
Excellent. Let me find one here. So here's Simon's first one. So I'm now looking at this as me, or no, as the first PR user who is effectively Simon's peer, right? Like another outside contributor. And so Simon has done his little comments. Oh, look at that. So you want to explain it?
Yeah, so I hit the M- issue. So I decided to put a comment around this and then add a little screenshot of the original, so you can see I am as a wind. I've got my M- there in the original. It looked like that, just so that we can have a conversation about whether or not that's the right typographical approach for rendering this poem.
Yep. And in a long pull request where a bunch of code gets changed, you could have multiple threads like this. You can talk about this line or that line, and they can kind of branch off into like a more targeted discussions. So to someone who, like my fake user, this is a discussion that they're allowed to join, right? But they don't really have the authority to do anything with the code, right? But if I change browser tabs now, and I go back to the browser tab where I'm me, the maintainer of it, and I go to that same pull request, you'll see a slightly different interface. You'll see at the bottom that there's now a big green button that says merge pull request. And if I hit that, it will accept Simon's changes into the repository, right? But being part of, when I look at it, the first thing I'll do, I'll read what they have, and then I hit this tab right here, file changed, and this will show me the changes, right? And so to me, as a responsible maintainer, I always want to just carefully walk through the changes, make sure I understand everything that's happening, and then I'm allowed to make comments that are part of a code review that can happen through the GitHub interface, where I could say, well, I could ask Simon a question. Why did we do this? Or I could suggest a change. What's like, this is okay, but what if we could save 2 lines of code if we wrote it this other way, right? Or this looks like maybe a bug, and that conversation can happen through this process. So in our case here today, whoa, my desk is going down. Woo. My standing desk just rebelled. So in my case here today, the review for this repository is not really a code review, right? It's a text review. And so I have Firmage's first edition. And so I'm going to go to the index of this, and I'm going to look up Simon's poem, which is Supposing I Dreamed This, right? Which is on page 311. So I'm going to thumb to that. And then I'm going to just proof his key punching against what I find in Firmage's edition. And that also gets us both the first edition and Firmage, which is kind of what I'm going for, right? And so should we have a poetry reading? Supposing I dreamed this, only imagine. Oh, I see the first thing. So we see here, this is actually a sort of, there's no way Simon would have known this, but in many of the first editions of Cummings, there are spaces put after the commas in the poems, but the scholars have found that in his original intention in his archives, he omits those, right? And so this is a case where there is probably a discrepancy between the first edition and Firmage, but our policy as a site is to exclude those spaces. And so this would be a case where I could make the change myself, or I could suggest the change to Simon. I think there even is a suggestion option, right, Simon? So that's
in fact, you can
suggest the code change, right?
You
and
can
so
apply the change directly, I think, because you're the owner of the repository. That's allowed too.
I definitely could, but I'm going to do like the starter review. And so now I've just made a kind of suggestion, right, that we're going to change, remove that space. Only imagine when day has thrilled. Day has thrilled. I like that. You are a house around which I am a wind. Your walls will not reckon how strangely my life is curved, since the best he can do is to peer and then peer through windows unobserved. This is another case where we want to take the space out. And so then I'm going to add another comment there. Right, through space unobserved. M dash looks good, Simon, nice. And then here's another one where we want to take the space out. Add the review comment. Listen, for out of all things, and then there's no space after the parenthesis. This is another change. Right. Dream is no one's fool. I love the curly quote there, Simon. Well done. Semicolon. If this wind, who I am, prowls carefully around this house of you, love being, so Simon's got there, I'm like thumbs up, so I can resolve that and say, good job, Simon. And then that one closes, right? Love being such, and so here we have another white space thing. So I'm going to hit the suggestion button and just make that little change. Such or such, the normal corners of your heart will never guess how much my wonderful jealousy is dark. If light should flower, oh, you have a semicolon, and in Firmage, it's a colon.
Huh.
We could look back at the first edition. I'm not, it's pretty hard to read that scan sometimes. Or laughing sparkle from the shut house around and around which a poor wind will roam. Okay, so that's the poem. With these minor changes, I would be okay with including it. So I've made my suggestions to Simon, and then I'm going to hit finish your review. And I can hit a button here called request changes. And so then this is going to be a volley that I send back to him, the contributor. I'm going to say, and then I can send a message that will go back to him. So I can say contribution looks great generally. And this is where, again, being polite is always a good approach, especially if you're dealing with people you don't know. Contribution looks great generally. Thank you for doing this. I'm play acting a little here. there are a few, and then explaining why I want to make the changes. There are a few small inconsistencies between the first edition's spacing and what we see in Firmage's complete poems, which is our authoritative source. I've made those changes here, those edits here. Once they're accepted, we can merge this request, right? So that's my little note back to Simon. I have options here to either just send a general comment, to sort of do a thumbs up and approve it, because sometimes multiple people approve things before they go out. And then finally, there's one that's called request changes, which is maybe the most common, where you're saying, look, here's what I want you to do, right? And so I hit submit review, and that is a code review. If you've ever heard that term, we just did it. And we can see that back on the pull request, there my comment appears with this sort of form for Simon. Because I use the suggestion panel, he's actually able to accept my suggestions with new commits simply by hitting the little pull down in these conversations. This is an incredible GitHub feature, a great example of just making things easier through user interface. So Simon, I'm just going to go ahead and accept these just to show how it works.
Oh, I've accepted some of them already, so this might result in an interesting collision. Let's see what happens.
I'll do the last two here. Don't worry about it.
I'd suggest doing a merge, a squash merge on this one, because otherwise we'll end up with an ugly set of tiny.
Yeah, that's fine. So we've done this and the changes are there. And so now if I go back to files changes and I look, we can see that those white spaces are gone, right? They've been fixed. I'm feeling good about the poem. Could always be something else goes wrong, but I see the change requested shows up. I'm now feeling good about it. And so I think there's a way I can then accept the changes, right? So like back here, I do in the interface, I say, yep, I'm good with it now, approve. And now you can see my approval shows up, everything's run through, and I have this big green button to merge the pull request. Simon was saying I should squash it, which basically means combine everything into a single commit so that all our little changes don't go into the log, which is, you know, more of a aesthetic thing, but I think the correct decision. And so I'm just going to say, let's squash it. They all get put together into one commit message. And I hit that button. And now it says, you know, pale wire merged this commit into master. And if we look at the commit log for the repository, which we see right here, we now see in the most recent commit message is Simon, right? And so he's now, I think for the first time, an author on this repository, and the change from his fork has been integrated into the main branch. Congratulations, Simon. Thank you for doing it. His ticket was number 181. If I go back to that ticket, oh, that's the pull, this ticket, it should close automatically, but sometimes that takes a minute, just because GitHub has like a process that has to play out. He maybe didn't say fixes in his message. And so I'm just going to go ahead and close this issue manually, because that poem has been entered. And so I think we're good to go, right? We have on our page now 14 pull requests, which is so exciting for me. Thank you guys for putting these in. This is awesome. Once class is over, I'm going to go through and review all of these and get everybody's poem in by, I hope, the end of the day. If there's any small stuff, I might just clean it up myself or, you know, send it back for commit comments in case anybody has any issues. One final thing I want to show you is that because of how this repository is set up, when you make a code commit, it automatically republishes the website. And that's via another great GitHub feature, which is called Actions. And so Actions, which is another tab at the top, is effectively a cloud computing platform dedicated just to your repository. This is a truly incredible feature of GitHub. So basically, you're able to take events that occur within your repository or scheduled tasks that you set up yourself, and you're able to run your code in the cloud for free if your site is open source, which is just, it's like the greatest thing going in open source software, if you ask me. And what I've done, if you read the code repository, is I've configured this repository with an action that uses the Baker Framework's tools to republish the website every time there's a code commit. And so we can see here that 2 minutes ago, when we merged Simon's code, it rebuilt and republished the website. And so Simon's poem was supposing I dreamed this, right, Simon? And so now this is the big drum roll, please. If I go to Cummings.ee and I go to the is5 and I go to supposing I dreamed this, look, it's now a hyperlink, right? When before it wasn't. And if I click in, there's Simon's work now transcribed and available on the web. We hope, forever, or at least until the end of, the internet. And available in Google search, also available automatically as a CSV or JSON output. If anybody wants to create an EE Cummings bot, I will work with you. I would love to see that happen. But everything is machine readable on the site. My dream is to do more with that. One of my friends has said we just have to name it Deep Fakes with 2 capital E's, and I think we'll that's my only request. So we'll get everybody else in, but that's effectively the whole cycle and the end of the spiel. If you were to enter more than one poem, you could just repeat that over and over again to enter each poem. Sometimes people will submit multiple poems at the same time. This is like a matter of art with pull requests, which is, do you just do one thing or do you try to do multiple things to save time? I think Simon and I are probably on the one thing at a time kind of train, just because that makes the life of the maintainer easier.
Definitely,
And
yeah.
the code is more easily kind of managed. But honestly, that's all a matter of kind of art, and approach. So, with that, we've really reached the end of the tutorial and what you need to see on my screen. But I'd like to leave some time now just to answer your questions and just have a, talk about anything you want to talk about related to pull requests or open source software or GitHub or modernist poetry, if you want to continue to indulge me. So what do you guys want to know?
I got a quick question. I was curious so when I was doing my poem, for this specific instance, I couldn't read some of the words because of the scan.
Yeah.
So is there sort of a standardized way or something for me to bring that to, in this case, your attention that, look, I'm trying to submit something I know isn't done or right, but it's most of the work?
So this is with the example we showed with my pull request. I like using the comments on lines feature. So you can put in the poem, submit the pull request, and then you can add your own comments to the pull request saying, these 3 lines here, I don't think are quite right. So I did that by adding in a little screenshot. You don't even need to do that. And yeah, that's something that I think is really important is it's okay to talk to yourself in GitHub issues and GitHub pull requests. I have a lot of repositories with issue threads with dozens of comments that are all just me talking back and forth and recording the decisions I was making and asking myself questions that I resolve later on. But these things are free. There's no size limits on them. There's no reason not to add information and questions like that.
And I think raising it as a discussion item is definitely the way to go, because who knows who's maintaining the repo, and if you don't know them, you can get differing results. But I think most maintainers want people to be transparent, to ask their questions and just to raise problems. Most people, that's what most maintainers want. Obviously, there are jerks on the internet, and so it happens every once in a while. You will have what we call nerd testosterone where I work that'll come up in these conversations, but I think you should err on the side of just clear communication. And so in the case of this repo, I would want just like what Simon proposed, or even somebody just filing an issue. Honestly, I am fine with people filing issues that are just questions. What do I do? And then we just have the conversation in the issue. And it can almost be like a helpline, because I would rather have that conversation than the person not contribute, and I want to know about the problems. In this case, the particular thing is we already have a policy, which is we go to the firmage, right? And that's based on my reporting, where basically I developed a little cadre of EE Cummings scholars who I interviewed, and I got their advice, and they were like, if it's ever weird, just use the firmage. And so that's kind of our policy. And there actually is a file in the repo called the contributing file, which you'll see on a lot of repos, where I've kind of laid out the rules of the repo. I didn't show that today, but in there you can find the explanation of the YAML, the links to the first edition, and some answers to kind of an FAQ about issues like this. And in there it just says, we go to the firmage, which has its own problems, but is, better than not knowing. We could always go back to the library and just look at it. But they actually have more than one first edition at Central Library. They were rebound by the library about 50 years ago, prior to the fire. So they survived the fire. which there's a whole book about. Susan Orleans wrote, called The Library Book. It's about the LA library fire. Excellent book. And the history of Los Angeles as well.
Do you mind if I just ask a clarifying question there? So in terms of like, Simon, your workflow there, where you're saying you're commenting. So if I'm on where my pull request is in GitHub, I've just got this branch as no conflicts with base branch, and then I've got the option to leave comment below. Is that where you're having that conversation, or are you opening up the file that shows the
two places? I'll often, if there's an issue, I tend to prefer using the issue for the comments. Once I've opened a pull request, I'll use comments on the pull request. And either's fine. They're both places where people see. You can add comments to individual commits, but I don't feel like that's as good a place just because people can miss them there. Like the issue in the pull request, everyone involved in the repository is going to be reading everything on the issues and everything on the pull request. That's the safest place to put this stuff.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Ben, I couldn't help but notice you mentioned, this is actually kind of like more of a Baker related question. I was playing around with your first Visual Story
Cool.
setup, and it was really, really well done. And I was actually trying to hack it to redesign like my personal site, because I know it's mainly made to be just like a one-page kind of thing. But I'm assuming in Baker you're able to like make a somewhat more, not super robust website, but something that has a couple of, handful of different pages. Is that something that's appropriate? Because I've never actually submitted a pull request to an open source project. And I know obviously different maintainers have their different kind of like general, like what's accepted and what's not. From what you said, is submitting just kind of an issue, even though it's not an issue, but just like hey, is there a best practice of how to make
I'm
this
fine
into
with
a website?
that because I want to know from my users what the problem is. And so if they want to email me, that's fine. If they want to file an issue, that's fine. Because I often think it's better if it's an issue, because then future
Other
people could
exactly.
Google it and see the conversation.
Totally.
It sounds like in this case, it may be like a documentation bug. You know what I mean? There might be a way to strengthen the documentation. So to answer the question, basically every HTML file you make in the Baker project will be served. And so you could just make a file called foo.html, and then there'd be /foo on your site. And so you can ad hoc make as many pages as you want, which may not be documented well enough now that I think about it. Right.
It was really much more like connecting them kind of before, because like it's really just my lack of general. I'm not a web developer kind of thing, but it was a desire of mine because I was like, oh, I really like this framework. Because I really was originally using looking at some of the other ones, and I was kind of like, oh wow, this is really cool. So the
other feature I'd point you to that's really powerful is you can dynamically generate pages.
Right. That was kind of my hope, was that like for like a blog that I might have on my personal site, it would dynamically generate.
So for instance, Baker does the LA Times coronavirus tracker, which has a page for each of California's 58 counties, but there's only one template, right? And then there's a little bit of JavaScript that's in the configuration file that tells it to generate one for each county. That I think is better documented, but I'm sure could be improved. So if you really wanted to be like the A++ student that the maintainers love, is if you figured it out, you would submit the README edit that's missing. Like if you really want to make friends, like that stuff like that, people love.
I do that all the time. Typos of like, if anytime you see a typo in any documentation, you can submit a pull request. But also, I love adding examples, because everyone who writes documentation always forgets that people just want to see an example of the thing. If you find something that's missing an example and you submit an example, there's a good chance it'll be accepted.
Yeah, and you might not hear back from them for months. Who knows if they're paying attention or whatever, but it's a nice thing to do.
Totally.
I think you just commented on a question that I had as tied to this, because you guys said that one pull request at a time is better handleable or whatever. But so if I was looking at the reading documentation or something, and I saw a typo, like how small of a thing is worthy of a pull request, or should it just be like
that's worth it?
A one character typo, totally worth it. I accept pull requests like that all the time.
I love them. And I do those too. Just being a news person, you get kind of uptight about that stuff. You know what I mean? And so like, if honestly, we just went through the class, right? We just went through that class. So that class we just did is a repo on GitHub, right? And so did you guys spot any typos? I'm sure they're in there. Did anybody, you know, if you saw one, we could do a pull request right now. I would, you know, or if like, did I get a link wrong? You know, I'm sure I screwed something up. I think I wrote that with 3 beers on Wednesday night. So like, I'm sure something is wrong. Right. And so that would be a case where I've actually had people do that on other classes, and I really appreciate it. You know, I think it's great. Sometimes it's embarrassing to see all your typos, but you get over that.
Thanks.
Yeah. I misspelled persuasive. I saw that this morning. Duh. You could write a bot that just found typos on GitHub, couldn't you?
People have done it. It
Have they?
gets yeah. There are companies that do bots that like run automatic analysis and then spam repos with pull requests suggesting fixes, and they tend to get banned. Like there are
That's
limits to what people will put up
If it
with.
was a security flaw, that's one thing, but like, yeah. Other questions?
Then I have to bounce in a bit, but
Okay.
I just wanted to ask you. So you're going to be at NICAR next year?
Yes, I will be in Nashville. That's what we were talking about earlier. So folks who don't know, our data journalism world, which is kind of where I was nurtured and brought into adulthood, allegedly, has an annual conference which is called the NICAR conference, and it's in a different city every year. And so it's where the data journalists of the world kind of convene. Classes like this, it's what I love about it is it's really a hands-on event. It's a place where people teach each other code and teach each other data analysis and teach each other how to file public records requests for valuable government databases, and like all this kind of the place where journalism and technology meets is at this conference, and it's really focused on skills building. And so I have a little dog and pony show of these kind of first classes where I have 5 or 6 of them, and so we'll do a couple at NICAR. We're going to do the one I do the most, which is called First Python Notebook, which is really teaching people data analysis with the Jupyter Notebook, which Simon has helped with in the past. And I want to do First Visual Story, but I haven't heard back yet. But you know, we have a few other ones. There's one. So if you go to my website, which is Pale Wire, you can find them in the documentation page. There's ones for GitHub Actions and Django admin panels and a couple other things.
Yeah, I'm bummed. I'm going to be in a wedding in India and I'm going to miss it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Going to a wedding in India, though.
Yes.
You can't miss that.
I'm very excited.
Wow, that would be incredible.
Yeah, I'm very excited. It happens to be like the literal weekend that it's happening. So
which city? Whereabouts in India?
It's going to be in Agra, which
Okay.
of course has the Taj Mahal, but some friends and I are going to be hanging around in Delhi beforehand, and yeah, we're making a whole ordeal out of it. One of my first friends from college to kind of get hitched. So
oh, that's awesome. I've never been to India, but I've always wanted to go.
I'm so tempted to just, bring my computer and join virtually, but my worst demons, I'm gonna let that. There'll be other years. But if you said you've never been to Nashville, this isn't related to this class at all, but you gotta try the hot chicken if you're a spicy food person.
Definitely taken over Los Angeles. It's colonized our fair city.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah,
I should get the real thing, right?
No, I mean, if you get the authentic one, I mean, I'm not a spicy food person, but it was at a different dimension. It's the hot one's kind of special almost. You get that whole experience.
Yeah, I got to do that. You're right. I got to do that. That's going on the list.
But yeah, Simon, Ben, thank you so much. I always appreciate both of you guys putting these things on, and they're super helpful. And so yeah,
thank
really
you for coming. Thank you. I'm glad it's helpful.
Totally. All right. Have a good day, guys.
Yep, you too. Anything else folks want to talk about? No pressure or anything, but my wife's out of town. I got nothing to do.
Can I just confirm what actually happened in terms of, so I had a fork of your repo.
Mm-hmm.
I then made changes to that, my fork.
Yes.
And then what kind of, I'm just getting my head around what actually happened for when I'm creating that pull request, and what goes, what kind of happens there, if that makes sense, for it then to turn up in the original repo. I'm just trying to get my head around.
No, I understand it.
Does that make sense? Or I don't know if I'm explaining myself well there. So
I mean, I guess one way to think is nothing changes at all until the pull request is approved. You know, you've got your changes in your repository. The pull request is almost a sort of transient sort of you've started that conversation. You said to Ben, here are the changes I would like to make. And nothing will happen. Then we can have a conversation around this thing and so forth. But until he hits that big green button, there are no changes made to your repository or to his repository. When he hits the green button, his repository gets updated. Again, your repository stays alone, and you could leave it there for the rest of the time, and it'll sit there as a sort of frozen version of the thing that you were working on. But so really, the magic moment is it's the merge. It's when those changes that you've suggested are merged into Ben's repository that and added and published to the website.
Yeah, and so I've shared my screen again. So I think this is one you entered, right? And so we can see that this green highlighted thing, that's the patch that you're nominating for inclusion. And so what closes the circle is that is sent back across to the original, right? And then I'm asked to merge it into mine. And so basically your changes would be integrated, right? And so GitHub is really, the reason it's worth so much money and it's done so well is it just makes like buttons and forms to make that easier, right?
Right.
But underneath the hood, if I put .diff at the end of the URL, we see actually the code that goes to the computer. And so this is the patch, or what used to be called the diff.
Before GitHub and things like GitHub, this was all done over email. You'd have a mailing list and people would be emailing each other. Literally, these diffs would be sent via email, and it was horrible. It was such a difficult process for everyone involved because you have to manage your email inbox and apply these changes one by one and review them locally and so forth. And GitHub made all of that so much smoother. Like the amount of value it added to open source in general, just for making this stuff not be a horrifically like painful email-based process, was enormous.
Yeah.
That's useful. I think it's just because I suppose I'm thinking of just using the command line, and when you do that, the process is a little bit different. So from what I've seen here, kind of there's a bit of magic going on there. So I'm just trying to get my head around how that how would relate to maybe if I had my own fork locally.
So if
push
you're
the
using
changes.
the command line, the way that tends to work is that it's you do it all on your own computer, you make your changes, but then you push them to GitHub, and then you go and click the buttons on the web interface as well. So once you get to the pull request bit, that's where you're sort of moving away from what you do on the command line and moving into the things that you exclusively do on GitHub.
Okay.
That's right. And so I think like the pull request really is a GitHub thing, not a Git thing. You know what I mean? When you really like get into it, it's kind of like a branded thing that they invented.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a terrible name.
It is. I still don't know why they called it a pull request, but it's been a revelation in software development just generally, like the amount of productivity it's unlocked.
If it was called a merge request, I think I would be happier. But
that
like,
would make sense. Yeah.
My like rant on version control is it's just the number of mixed metaphors in version control is just incredible. Like, is it a tree? Like, is it a master and a slave? Is it a, you know what I mean? Is it then what is a pull and a push? Like, how do you pull the tree? You know, it's like it's so confusing.
Yeah.
And they used to call the main or master branch the trunk. You remember that? Which is why it's called a branch, right? But then they stopped calling it the trunk. And so you're like, oh, why are we still calling it a branch? And like, it's just, the whole thing is a mess. Like, they just need to pick one metaphor and make it work. But that'll never happen, of course, because it's open source software. So we're just lucky it's not full of like misogynist jokes or something. But
well, the misogynist jokes have been filtered out over time.
Over time, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It only took 30 years.
Well, also, the default branch on Git was called master until a couple of years ago, and there was a huge like industry-wide effort to switch that default to be called main instead, which was, and it worked to be. I think it's really impressive that it's right.
But if you look at my Cummings repo, it's still the master branch because I made it before that whole change happened. And like, I haven't spent the 30 minutes it would take to make that change, which I probably should do. It's just like one of those things I haven't got to, you know.
Is there a way to update my fork to match the master again, or do I have to
Great
refork
question.
it?
That's
Now
called,
I have two forks.
There is. That's called fetching upstream. So this is another metaphor. It's a river metaphor, right? Which is that your code is downstream of the trunk, right? And so when changes are being made to what you forked from, you might want to catch up at some point, right? And so that scene is going to the upstream origin, right? And so so in GitHub's language, they call that fetching upstream. And you can do it from the command line by like with a couple command line tricks, but then there's also a way to.
I have to look it up every single time I do it. I've been doing this stuff for like 15 years. I can't remember how to fetch from upstream, and I have to go and Google for it every single time.
It is a pain. And so GitHub interface, you can see my screen. They have a little button here for this, which is sync fork, right? And that'll let you do that. And then there's this is the pull request button that isn't the pop-up. And so they kind of hide that stuff in here. And so like a cycle would be, let's say I want to contribute like something later, is I would go back to my main branch. I would fetch upstream to make sure I've caught up. I would then make a new branch where my new pull request number 2 is going to go, and then I would submit that, right? The only time you have an issue there is like, well, if your changes conflict with something that's upstream. Let's say in the in-between period, right, you've edited a file that changed upstream, right? And then when you fetch, you get the most infamous hell of Git, which is a merge conflict, which is, well, you changed something that somebody else changed, and which one do we keep, right? And there's like a whole process for dealing with that. And slaying your first like conflict message is like part of your rite of passage as like as a computer programmer. It's a river metaphor. And then why is it called origin? That's just like sysadmin talk, right? Yeah. Anyway, other questions? All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate your contributions. I'm going to go get something to eat. My wife's out of town, so I'm thinking ramen. And then I'm going to take our video and try to post it on YouTube, get all your pull requests in, and I'll probably send an email to kind of everybody who expressed interest, so people who couldn't make it today can, maybe contribute a poem or watch it at their leisure. We'll see. But I really appreciate it, you guys showing up. I really, really personally appreciate you helping with my little pet project. I hope it also helped you at the same time. My hope is that by the end of the month, we'll have the whole book in. So that's it. Simon, any parting words?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is this stuff is really, really convoluted, but the stuff that we've shown you on GitHub, specifically that GitHub.dev thing, is such a huge leap forward in making this stuff actually pleasant to use. So I'm really excited about it. I think it does make this stuff a heck of a lot less painful for people to get involved with.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'll see you guys on GitHub.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Simon. That was awesome. Perfect.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.